while, but this is Five Tree Hill.
This is Five Tree Hill in Williston,
Wow, you
Vermont.
can see everything. It's such a beautiful spot to look out across the Champlain Valley.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite spots to walk to.
You must come here a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The dog likes it too.
This is right in the town of Williston, where you live.
Right.
And you wear many hats here. I know you've lived here a long time, but you're on the Conservation Commission, Williston Conservation Commission, and you are the coordinator of the Champlain Valley chapter of Vermont Master Naturalists.
Right.
So you have lots of reasons to understand the history of your town and interest in that, and that's what I was hoping we'd do today. We'll walk together.
Yeah, I thought it would be really nice to start at the top because you can really envision. I mean, even the rock we're standing on, it has a story that's different from even the other side of Williston.
Wow.
And looking out, I mean, the Champlain Valley, Lake Champlain, and then the Adirondacks.
The snow, yes.
I know, the snow's great.
So we're here, an early side of the winter, but already snow coming down, and it's supposed to happen off and on through the day. So I thought we'd start up here, and we wanted to talk about the bedrock geology, which is the oldest event that's happened in this Williston landscape. And then we're going to just work our way down toward Sucker Brook Hollow and meet up with Sam Ford, talk about the more recent events, including settlement history, the building of stone walls, and the big flood that we're going to explore. But let's start with geology. And I think just to set the stage of geology, let's think about what's happening right now, which is the North American continent is drifting toward China. Mm-hmm. China is drifting toward us at a fairly good clip, about as fast as your fingernails grow.
Yeah. And
all around that Pacific Ocean, which is being subducted under these continents, you have volcanoes, you have earthquakes, you have stuff piling up on top of each other, and that was all going on out here. That's the same story.
That's the same story.
So tell me more about it.
Okay, let's go take a seat.
Okay, it sounds like fun.
So, if we transport ourselves back to this spot 500 million years ago, where are we? Like, are we on a hill?
No, we wouldn't be.
Right.
We're at the bottom of an ocean.
We are. We're at the bottom of an ocean. And it's called the Iapetus Sea. It was an ancient ocean, and you can actually envision it because it was right on the shore of the Adirondack Mountains, and it's the same rock. Those Adirondack Mountains, that rock has been there over 1 billion years.
Wow.
I just like to think about it because it's so interesting that this rock, the clays of the sediment that washed off the Adirondacks, turned into this sedimentary rock that then again was transformed, but that can be later in the story. But the other thing that was going on was the very first reef system in the world.
So there was like life out there in this ocean.
Life in the water, not on land.
Not on land yet.
Right. So it's called the oldest coral reef in the world.
Wow.
Right here.
Wow.
And you can see it. If you walk on the New York side or the Vermont side, I just love looking for gastropods. You can see all the critters of that ancient reef as they were starting to evolve and as they began to evolve.
So for all this life to be forming and diversifying and evolving, and we have these coral reefs, we must have been somewhere warmer. Like, wasn't it true that the North American continent, Laurentia, was down near the equator?
Right. So the Adirondacks, those same rocks, were on the edge of a tectonic plate. They're moving north over the equator. Williston's not quite there yet.
Where is Williston?
I mean, we're moving along with it. We're in the clays at the bottom of the ocean.
Okay.
So sediments are coming off the Adirondacks,
which were much taller. They were actually mountains.
They were taller than the Himalayas.
They're like called the Grenvilles.
Yes.
So what's left of them are these really old roots of the mountains.
Right, they're the roots because they
Yeah.
eroded away.
Yes.
They were like times taller than the Himalayas.
Okay.
They were really tall. So sediments have been coming off into this ancient ocean. What do you see at the shore of the beach when you're in the tropics? You see sand.
Yes, sand.
Right. So you have sand,
Yeah.
and then you go in the water, and you have this ancient reef system. And what's happening is you have the sediments falling, and so here's a
This is my favorite rock ever.
yeah, this is a sedimentary rock shaped
Yeah.
like Vermont.
Yes, I love it.
So as sediments are coming down, like here's a layer, and then more sediments are coming down, what they're doing is here, I'll let you take the top off.
Okay. So they're burying things.
Right.
I love this.
The
Look at those,
life
those
that's,
seashells buried in your rock.
yeah,
This is such a cool hunt. And you found this yourself.
I found it
New York, upstate.
across the lake in
Yeah.
New York.
I love it.
So,
That's such a cool trick.
so what's happening is the sediments are covering up the trilobites, the crinoids, which are animals that have a stalk and they look like a starfish, cephalopods that are related to squids, and they're all living in the shallow, sunny water at the beach of the Iapetus Ocean, right there.
Wow.
And it's still right there. It's just fossilized.
That's so cool.
The oldest reef.
So when you look at a bedrock map of Vermont, there's so many different colors.
Right.
And it's because all those different rock types that formed in different shallow ocean conditions
Right.
got turned into rock. How did that all happen?
Well, it takes a long time.
Yes.
And a lot of sediment just piling up and the weight of it. But so you'd have sandstone at the shore, limestone where all the critters are and sediment, and here you have clays. But this rock is metamorphic, which means what happened was the North American continent, as it's moving north, and this other continent that's kind of called Proto-Europe, Africa, started moving back together.
Wow.
And the interesting part is when they met, the force of that continent meeting this one was there's so much pressure and heat that it changed this rock from sedimentary to metamorphic.
That's so cool.
And half of Williston is this metamorphic rock. Okay, it's coming from the east. And it's going that way, but guess what? The other side of Williston is still sandstone.
Wow.
Because that's closer to
The beach.
the beach.
Oh, this is fascinating. There's so much. I mean, this is 500 million years of history, so we could talk on and on and on about it.
Right, but that's the story.
Yeah.
We're standing on the clays, and why are we now on a hill? Because the continent pushed up the ocean floor, and Vermont is the ocean floor.
Almost all of it.
Almost all of it.
But what's interesting is as you cross over into New Hampshire, that's more like volcanic and plutonic and other
Right.
igneous rock.
Yeah, because
So, but we get all the
yeah.
cool plants that love these rich soils.
Right, we
Which
have
I love.
very
I love that.
different, higher biodiversity here than in New Hampshire because of that.
So one of the things that's always fascinated me about Williston, and this is from a really different era. So we're talking 500 million years ago, and to maybe 350 million years
Right.
ago, these rocks all formed and were metamorphosed and changed.
Right.
But very recently, in the glacial era, when people first arrived in Vermont, Williston at one point in time was right on the edge of another body of salt water called the Champlain Sea.
Right, and that's recent. People get confused because, there are two oceans. You have the Iapetus Sea, which was ancient, so millions of years ago. The Champlain Sea, and that's why that's so flat. That was the bottom of the Champlain Sea, and we're on the shore. That was 10,000 years ago.
Wow.
And so that is when people moved, they followed the glaciers, they moved in, and they started living around the Champlain Sea. And so in Williston, you have one of the oldest paleoarchaeology sites.
It's so cool. I love that. And I heard it was kind of confusing because they were seeing these linear fire pits.
Right.
And they were like, why? They thought people would be living more like in a village. But then they realized they were just sort of camping out on the edge of this one wood,
shore,
eating, clams.
That's what we would do.
Yeah, exactly. So I do want to make sure that we don't miss that chapter, which maybe it still has an effect, but maybe less of an immediate effect, which is that at one point before the Champlain Sea, also right after the glaciers retreated, there was a freshwater lake in here in front of the glaciers called Lake Vermont.
Right, that was glacial.
Lake Vermont.
Cold
And that
glacial water.
That had its bathtub ring of sandy soils and things
Right.
higher in elevation, so more like 625 feet above current sea level.
That's correct.
Are those bathtub rings in Williston, or is it all below that elevation, so they're more up in Underhill and Jericho?
No, you can see them here. So
You can.
Yes. So if you look out here, there's a mountain called Brownell Mountain that was an island.
In Lake Vermont.
In Lake Vermont. And then, this is actually an interesting story because, so you go to the Catamount Community Forest in Williston, the high hills there were also islands. And what happened was, as the glacier moved north, it started to melt. And one day, it melted enough that water started flowing north through it. And Lake Vermont drained in, they say, a matter of hours or days.
Wow.
Which is amazing.
Down to the level of the Champlain Sea. So it just dropped down, and then the ocean came in behind it.
Right. So the glaciers, which were 1.5 miles high, compressed the land, compressed the tectonic plate into
Wow.
Yeah.
The mantle of the earth.
The mantle of the earth so much that the Champlain Sea was actually an arm of the Atlantic. So down the St. Lawrence here. So you had whales.
That's so amazing.
The
seals.
State fossil is a whale of Vermont.
I heard there's still rare plants that grow along the shore of Lake Champlain.
Right.
But they came in when it was the sea.
Right.
And they just, as the sea kind of slowly receded, so the Lake Vermont drained quickly, but the sea, just the land rebounded and cut it off. Gradually. So you have a lot of, in Burlington, for instance, there's a huge delta of the Winooski River.
Right.
That grew into the Champlain Sea during that era.
Right.
So let me just get this straight. Iapetus Ocean, around 700 million years to about 500 million years ago. So oceans open and close.
Right. I think the continents started moving back together again around 450 million years ago.
So like what's happened with the Pacific.
Right.
That is shrinking.
Right.
Boom. You travel almost through all that time.
Right.
The glaciers are still blocking Lake Champlain's basin to the north. So that was Lake Vermont.
Right.
So that was maybe 13,000 years ago.
13,000 to 14,000.
Yeah. And then that drained and the sea came in.
Right.
And it covered a lot of Canada and northern New York. And this was just part of an arm of that Champlain Sea.
Right.
It's such a fascinating story. And they all left deposits. Like this bedrock is the deposit from the Iapetus.
Yeah, if you find sand, it's a beach. If you find clay, it's an ocean bottom. And you can find those things in the same place.
That's so interesting.
Because Taft Corners was the shore of the Champlain Sea.
So anything that's still in sediment is from those more recent bodies of water.
Right.
And all the Iapetus sediment has turned into rock.
It's turned into rock.
That's such a cool story.
It is really neat.
Let's hike down. We're going to go meet Sam.
Oh yeah, we better go. I think it's interesting. It's this really pretty stream near the top of Five Tree Hill that the stream must have been here for a long time because they built the stone wall on one side, and when they got to here, they started building it on this side.
Look at this one, Laura. It's really shaggy. Oh my goodness.
That's beautiful.
I love it when it gets these shakes. I mean, you know the story because we've talked about it, about Indian and bat nursery colonies that put their pups up under these warm trees. And the fact that we're in kind of a stand of them really makes me think about the site conditions here, that we've been seeing outcropping bedrock, so we know the soils are shallow. And we're on the west-facing slope, so we know it gets a lot of late afternoon sun.
Right.
So these trees, like the center of their range, would be much farther south of here, maybe in Tennessee. But they managed to hang out in Vermont on these really warm sites where the soils dry out and warm up in the spring, and then they get that hot summer sun.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I guess that's why there are so many of them right here.
Yeah, it's pretty telling. And it's unlike other things that we'll see on this mountain.
Right.
I mean, this is kind of an unusual stand of them. People refer to these trees, things like hickories and oaks, as trees with southern affinities, so they tend to be more widespread further south of us. In fact, a tree in the center of its range tends to be a generalist. It'll grow a lot of different places, but when it gets on, in this case, the northern end of its range, it needs very specific conditions to grow.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I just love looking up through all the shakes. Huh?
Yeah.
Such a cool view. Look at how beautiful the snow is on these white mushrooms.
It's really pretty.
All growing out of this old beech log. I felt like as we were coming down the hill, it just glowed.
There are a lot of pieces of it too on the sides. I wonder if something's been eating it.
Yeah, it does look over there like maybe something was chewing them off, huh? Like a chipmunk or a squirrel. Yeah, I know they do eat these mushrooms, these shelf mushrooms. I also feel like once the snow starts to come down on top of the brown leaves, it feels like we're hitting that transition from fall to winter. Like today.
Today
it feels like it, yeah. Huh.
Alicia, look at all the sapsucker holes in this tree. There are thousands, and they go all the way up the tree. Wow. It's incredible.
It is incredible. One piece of this story is that this is a basswood, which I've heard these yellow-belly sapsuckers just love. And I did find a basswood leaf. You can see that
there we go.
It's kind of matches. It's got the almost heart shape, and it's slightly asymmetrical at the base. Oh, and look at this one, Laura. So the basswood tells us that the soils here are on the richer side. They're higher in pH, more basic, you know, around 7. And this hop hornbeam tells us that as well. They tend to be on richer sites. One thing I love about hop hornbeam, you can see the bark is what you call cat scratched.
Oh,
you know, you can see really even furrows in it. And as they age, and this one's probably older than it looks, you know, they're really solid, like you can't move a hop hornbeam. They're sometimes a tree of a similar size, like you'd bang into it and you could get it to give a little, but not them. They're so tough. But they grow callus wood where they've dropped their lower branches, so over time they start to create these sort of faces, almost like elfin or gnomey faces in the bark. I love hop hornbeams.
Yeah, when we cut one to use it in the wood furnace, it's so dense. First of all, it's hard to cut through, but you can just put a log in there and
it burns forever.
It burns forever. So many BTUs.
It's so true. Yeah.
So Alicia, I wanted to bring you to this beech tree just because, well, for 2 reasons. First, it's a really beautiful beech tree. It does not have beech bark disease, which is pretty rare. Most of the beech trees I see do. But the other thing is Look at these claw marks from the bear that climbed up this tree
That's awesome.
to get the beech nuts.
Wow, look at that. You know, you can just imagine him shimmying up there.
Right.
Oh, beech nuts are so tasty. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to eat them.
No, I never
They're
have.
hard to find because everything wants them, so they eat them before you get there. But when you can find a nice ripe beech nut, it's just yummy, so sweet. Thank you. I love seeing this healthy beech in the middle of the forest that a bear climbed.
Yeah, that's neat.
All right, let's go find Sam. He'll be up here ahead.
Yeah, what a fantastic story 5 tells about Vermont and
Yeah.
human
It's like,
settlement history,
you know, every
geology.
place has its story, but sometimes
Yeah.
one place just tells like a lot of the stories. This is a really rich site. Hey, Sam. Thanks for meeting us here today.
Yeah, no problem.
So, Sam, we've been telling the story of this landscape from sort of the early Iapetus and the bedrock, and we're coming now into the settlement history part of the story. And you're a landscape historian with your business, Turnstone Research, and this is what you do. You look at landscapes and you figure out why things are the way they are. So, what have you discovered about these stone walls?
Yeah, so these stone walls were built by humans. They were stacked here like this. Most stone walls in Vermont we can date between 1810 to 1840. And that is because in 1809 a really significant event was happening abroad in Portugal. So Napoleon had conquered that country, and the consul to the United States was William Jarvis. And he had known about this particular breed of sheep called the merino sheep, and while everyone was busy doing other things with Napoleon arriving and all of that going on, he was able to smuggle out a couple thousand sheep, and he happened to have a farm in Wethersfield, Vermont. And so 1810 the sheep arrive and sheep farming takes off in Vermont. Before this point we had small subsistence farms, which were primarily farms that were, you provided all of your own resources that you needed. So you're essentially just surviving through the winter with your family. And in 1810 we see a shift for the first time to a really specific type of farming, and that's for sheep. So the merino sheep is a really particular breed that produces a large amount of fleece, or a large amount of wool from their fleeces, and it's a really nice soft wool that we all know and familiar with in Vermont. And it really took off, and so there was different international things going on that Vermont became one of the primary producers of this merino wool in the world. And so that's when we start to see a second wave of deforestation happening on the hillsides. We were clearing out the way to bring in as much sheep as we possibly could. And so these stone walls, as you're clearing out all of your farmland and you no longer have trees with their root systems holding down the hillsides, you suddenly start to get stones cropping up. A lot of farmers used to joke in the spring that the only crop they really produced well was stones. And so for a couple weeks every spring, you and your kids would go out to your land and you would start pulling off stone walls so that you could start tilling for the year. These stone walls are as individual as the farmers who built them. Everyone had a different personal preference for how to build their walls. We won't necessarily know which technique was used for this wall, but this wall does tell us about what types of farming was going on this landscape, because these are fairly larger stones. You can see some smaller ones throughout. And so large stones need to come out of your tilling fields, and small stones need to come out of your tilling fields, but only the large ones need to come out of your pasture lands, so where you're putting your sheep and your livestock. They can work around the stones. But wherever you want to run a plow through, you really need to get whatever is coming up in the spring out of the way.
So, Sam, I just want to be clear. These big stones indicate that somewhere, probably on one side or the other of the wall, there were animals. And the smaller stones, when they're present in a wall, indicate that one side or the other may have been plowed.
Correct, yeah. So these stone walls, you can start to, as you are moving along them in the woods and you're starting to pull out the different stone sizes and noticing there's some smaller ones, which smaller ones I would classify as anything that's about handheld, either with one hand or two hands, that you wouldn't mind carrying around for a long time. And even stuff that's that small would really damage your plow, so it was important to move them out of the way. And so that's why you would use your stone boats, so you could sort of pile them up onto the sled and then use your horses or your oxen to move them around A lot of people, when they encounter stone walls in the woods, think that they have also encountered a boundary line or an ancient boundary line for a farm. And while sometimes that's true, primarily it's not. This is probably not the best example being right on this road here. But this does tell us that if this side is the road, then that side would have been a tilling pasture or a tilling field and not a pasture, because we do have these little stones that are right here.
So I'm curious to hear a little more about this, that stone walls are not necessarily from boundaries. What I'm hearing you say is they're maybe internal to the farm and they designate the edges of different uses and not of the whole lot that is the farm itself. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, exactly. So when you encounter stone walls, you may either be on a road and in fact on a property boundary, or you're going to be in the middle of the farm itself. And so by looking at the stone wall and the different sizes of the stones in the wall, you can start to figure out where you are on the farm. So these farms are usually about 100 acres. This particular farm was 100 acres. And so when you're encountering a stone wall, you start to figure out where on that 100 acres am I? Where can I expect to then find a farmhouse or a farmhouse foundation or a barn foundation or additional stone walls that may have a different makeup of stones in them. And so you would bound your fields with as much as you could produce within a certain amount of acres. This was another one of those individual things for each farmer, had different ideas of field size for the size of the farm, how much they needed to produce. So in the earlier 1800s, 1810s, when we're first building stone walls on subsistence farms, you don't need surplus on your farm. You don't need to create a lot of extra crops and materials, because we haven't transitioned into a point where we have market farming. There aren't necessarily markets yet. There's very rudimentary road systems in town, and you were on more of a barter system with your neighbors for help with labor, where if you ran out of hay and you need to borrow hay from your neighbor over the wintertime, you may replace that with not necessarily hay or any other type of resources that you had that they then needed. So wood for hay, or helping to raise their barn the next year, it was an individual transaction that was going on between you and your neighbors for what you needed help with. So if you encounter a stone wall like this, and let's say the road's not behind us, we can see there's big stones and there's little stones. And so we start to think, okay, there's little stones here, so we know there was tilling going on. Was the tilling happening on this side of the stone wall, or was the tilling happening on the other side, or perhaps on both sides? So usually these were some form of a barrier, and later on they became a very important barrier for livestock, not necessarily for boundary lines between you and your neighbors. Because on that 100 acres, you're not going to take these big giant stones 100 acres to the other side just to tell your neighbor where your farm starts.
Right.
That's a lot of work, so that you're not going to go to that trouble. But what you do need to do is get all of these stones out of your tilling lands every spring, and they need to go somewhere. So in these early 1810 stone walls, they are just linear refuse piles. It's getting the stones as far as you're willing to carry them, which often isn't very far, and only a couple acres for each field. And they're not necessarily stacked. These are very nicely stacked. This has been left like this for a very long time, and it's been able to maintain its relative size and shape. So these early stone walls were sort of just rubble along the edge of your field. And what would happen is later on in the 1840s, as stone walls were continuing to be built for those 30 years, it would take about 2 men all day to build 10 feet of stone wall.
Wow.
It's a lot of work. And so later in the 1840s, as we are shifting to market farming and we do need surplus and we are starting to get larger fields and more fields, and you do want to have a cash value for your farm, so you are now using cash. We're moving away from the barter system. We want to start to see different stones in the walls in a different orientation. It's no longer the rubble stone walls, the linear refuse piles. We start to see built stone walls being dried laid like they are here, with some level of skill involved to ensure that maintenance year after year isn't going to take too much of your time, because you still are producing stones from your fields. And so finding ways to build them up taller and higher. And after the 1840s, there's another major shift in Vermont farming. This is going away from the sheep farming and the wool industry that has now collapsed and wool prices are plummeting, and so farmers are needing to diversify once again. And so we see this shift into dairy farming for Vermont. And so previously the early stone walls were much lower, those rubble piles. Sheep aren't going to jump over anything they can't see over. Cows, however, are very intelligent animals. They know they have a choice when they meet a barrier, this side or that side. So you need to have those stone walls built up stronger, larger, taller in order to keep the cattle in. And at this point we see the shift into the market farming, and agriculture needs to be protected. It has to be, it's an investment at this point. So you don't want your cows to get out. That can ruin your neighbor's livelihood for the year. And so it becomes really important to have the second level or second wave of stone wall building to make them taller.
It's so fascinating that stone walls have gone through these series of evolutions from being just rubble piles to actually corralling animals in or out, you know, first sheep and then cows, you know, of an area. And these are large stones, but there's an even bigger stone just up the road here that I'd love to go take a look at, that I think has a different story. And it's not related to humans moving the stones around. Let's go take a look at this other rock. So I've always loved this giant rock, and I know it catches your eye whenever you walk by here. This is a private logging road, so we're not going to walk up here, but I've been up there before with the landowner, and it's a beautiful rock. And one of the things that's striking about it is it's a rich red color, which indicates to me that it's from the Moncton Formation. It's Moncton Quartzite. So it is a true glacial erratic. It was moved here by ice. Because it doesn't match this gray schist that is the country rock. So it's a rock of a different type, out of place and time. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet today is how much the glaciers have impacted Vermont and this particular landscape. You know, just that 1.5 miles of ice that flowed over Sucker Brook Hollow and left glacial till, things ground up under it, which is where these rocks for the walls are coming from, and things like this glacial erratic that just melted out of the glacier as it retreated. So two different huge phases of that ice age where the ice is advancing and grounding and plowing stuff up, and then as the climate warmed and it started to melt back through Vermont, we had lots of water flowing everywhere, things being deposited and really out of place. So we're going to head on down on this public trail where we're allowed to walk and explore some more.
So Sam, these are the small stones you were talking about.
Yeah, this is a great example of a very different type of wall with much, much smaller stones. I mean, really tiny, almost pebble size. So I like to call these potato stones because they're about the size of a potato, and you often find potato-sized stones on properties where potatoes are one of the primary crops that they're producing. And so if you're already in the dirt trying to clear out all your potatoes, and you're also finding all of these much smaller stones, which probably wouldn't necessarily get in the way of your plow, they might, but it's a fairly high level of stone clearing that you don't see very often, especially on a wall like this, and just how tall it is and how well it's been preserved like this. But if you're already taking all your potatoes out of the ground and you're coming across these same size potato stones, then it's worth the effort to then remove those too, because the less stones in your field means more protection for your plow. It's easier to go about your farming. And what's really nice about this wall is we were talking about earlier how you can tell by the stones in the wall and some other clues by what was going on either side of the wall. So we've got on our side of the wall a line of really big trees that you can see, which if this was the side where the livestock were, those would get grazed pretty quickly. So they were allowed to grow up along this wall boundary, and were protected from grazing livestock. So we know that this side probably would have been more tilling land, and then the opposite side of the wall would have been where the livestock were grazing in a pasture.
So another thing I noticed about these rocks is it seems like they're indicating a change in substrate because they look a little water worn, like they might be part of a cane terrace, whereas the ones down below looked more like ledge. They kind of just come from the bedrock. So
Yeah, these are rounded.
they're very rounded. But you were also saying something interesting about potatoes themselves and how they showed up in the hills of Vermont.
Right, yeah, so what I was talking about, these are potato stones. They're much smaller stones, especially from the other wall that we were looking at. And what's neat about the potato story in Vermont is that the potatoes originated in the Andes with the Inca, and they had large plantations high up in the mountains. And Vermont also has taller mountains and rocky soils, and so it was a really natural place for the potatoes to really come in and take off with. We see them a lot on the higher mountain farms in Vermont during that 1810 to 1840s land clearing era, where we are moving up the hillsides.
Wow.
And what's interesting is they didn't come directly from the Andes. They actually came from Ireland with the Irish farmers and the Irish immigrants that were moving here during the potato famine.
So the potatoes have been on a long journey to land in the mountains of Vermont, huh?
They have,
From
yes.
South America over to Europe and back again. It's wild to think of these sort of stories around crops and food, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
Speaking of food, let's go eat lunch. So Sam, we're sitting on something here that's stacked rocks, and one of the things that I love about the work you do is that you're able to take this evidence in the field and dig through the historical documents and come up with a story that explains what this feature is. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, sure. So we're sitting on the remnants of a dam that was once part of a milling site here in Williston. And this dam is actually pretty old. It was one of the first mill dams that was installed in town here, and it was installed in 1812 by Amos Thatcher.
Okay.
So the Thatchers were here. They were one of the earlier farming families in Williston, and this dam sits on what used to be Sucker Brook. We've got some remnants of water here below us and above us, and so this dam was essentially functioning to hold back the stream to create two relatively smallish mill ponds. So this mill that we're sitting on was a sawmill, and so when the Thatchers arrived here, it was totally forested, much like it is now, probably with a different forest type than what we're seeing today. And so they needed to build something like a sawmill so that they could start to build houses. Their earliest houses would have been out of logs, hand-hewn, and they wouldn't have needed the sawmills, but later as town was growing up and wood resources were becoming more important, they needed things like sawmills to be able to plane the lumber and to process it. And you could also even take the branches off of the trees as you're processing them, and that could be used for something as potash, which is a really important early resource used for a variety of different household needs. And so this sawmill would have serviced a fairly small area here in Sucker Hollow, what was called Sucker Hollow. And so it probably would have been only a couple of local family farms that would have used this sawmill. And it was in use until about the 1860s, probably 1860 was the last year it was used. That's when Nathan Downer died. Because after the Thatchers, it passed to the Bassets, and after the Bassets, it passed to a sect of the Downer family.
So Sam, this kind of small operation of a sawmill or a grist mill or, other kinds of mills was happening all over Vermont. I love that this very specific story about Sucker Hollow was being played out in other parts of the state. But tell us more about what you understand about mills. I mean, it was a lot of work. These rocks are huge, the trees were big, people were working really hard on this land. How do you kind of picture that time and think of it in a broader context of Williston and the rest of Vermont?
When this mill went in 1812, that was only a couple of decades after Williston had first been settled. So in 1763, Williston was chartered officially by the governor of New Hampshire as part of the New Hampshire grants. And so there was a lot going on across what was the original 13 colonies. Vermont wasn't a colony, it was kind of this in-between space between New York and New Hampshire. And so in the 1760s, in the 1763 specifically, it was the end of the French and Indian War, and the governor of New Hampshire saw an opportunity to start chartering towns in what became the state of Vermont as a way to lay claim to this land, which had previously been very sporadically settled. There weren't a lot of organized towns or anything going in yet. And so when he chartered in 1763, it took another 20 years before people actually came up to see this land. So the town was spread out into a series of boxes on a map, and these boxes were all given numbers. And so you would pick your number out of a hat. Supposedly it was a blind process. You wouldn't know what parcel of land you got out of the hat until you came to see it. However, it is interesting that the wealthiest men did end up with the better parcels. So it's funny how that works out. And so they owned this land. They started organizing the town. There were town meetings that were held in Massachusetts and in Connecticut, and no one had actually come up here yet. So we don't see the first round of settlement in Williston until the 1770s. It's right around when the Revolution was breaking out. We were trying to secede from the king in England, and being this far north in Vermont, you were pretty close to what are now the British and Canada, and there were several natives still on their land in this area. And so as you were moving through this land, you weren't sure who you were going to encounter, if they were going to be friendly or not. There weren't a lot of resources available. It was really just you, and what you could carry here was what you had available to you. And so that was a pretty vulnerable place to be. So in the 1780s, 1783, after the end of the Revolution, we start to see the first true wave of year-round white European settlement in Williston and in northern Vermont. And so by the time the Thatchers were here in 1812 building this mill, Williston was still pretty brand new, especially being in the northern half of the state. There weren't, as I said, resources here. It was what they could carry with them on their animals or on their bodies to get to their land. And there weren't any directions. You had your slip of paper with your number on it. You were told generally where your land was off of like the big town survey, and then it was on you to figure out
where you landed. Wow.
Where is home now. So you arrive, you have these giant massive trees with these huge stumps, and you have to start processing them by hand. And so one of the easiest ways to create additional power was water. And water is a really efficient resource. It's a really efficient power source. And it doesn't take a large stream to generate the amount of power to start processing these giant trees. And so this Sucker Brook was one of those perfect spots. And when you go back through the early deeds for Williston, you can see that this was originally Lot 79 of the 3rd Division of Burlington, which is a different story for a different day, but is now Williston. And so Lot 79 was about 100 acres, and 3 acres were split off from Lot 79 that were deemed to be valuable because it kept coming up over and over again in the deeds. There's this 3-acre lot, this 1-acre lot, and eventually you start to see references to privileges upstream on these deeds, which means water rights, essentially. And what do you need water rights for? To dam a stream and to use it as an energy source to build something like a sawmill.
So I'm imagining if I were sitting here, well, first of all, if I were sitting here in, let's say, 1813 after this dam was built, I'd be wet.
Yes.
There'd be water pouring over
Yeah.
this, and thered be the racket and sound of logs being sawed, and things like that. Where did this water go? I mean, I think that's what's kind of a fascinating part of the story of the later Sucker Brook era, is that this water is now flowing somewhere else. So I'd love to go look at a deeper drop, a bigger fall, just down from here. Shall we go do that together?
Yeah, sounds great.
Sam, we're sitting on a downstream feature of the same mill pond, and look at that drop. I mean, they were doing stonework up here over this precipice, it's leading way down. And we have bedrock here. We're gonna talk a little bit more about what was next to us later, but tell me why this mill isn't still here.
Right, so we're at the lower dam for the sawmill, and this would have been at one point a very loud waterfall that we wouldn't have been able to sit here. And so in 1860 was the last time in the deeds you see a reference to the sawmill, and so it would definitely have closed probably between 1855 to 1860. In 1860, that's when Nathan Downer died, and so that's when his farm started to transfer into other hands. And at this point in the 1860s in Williston, having this small sawmill over here would have been a pretty expensive venture. Technology in water mills was changing at the time, starting to transfer over to water turbines, and that would have been really expensive to need to convert the mill over. And in 1850, we see the rail line going through North Williston, and that's when North Williston really takes off as the industrial hub of town. It's right near the Winooski River, and there were several sawmills out there. They had a little falls out there, and the mills out there would have been much more efficient. They had better technology to use more of the water power. So a mill of this size and age probably would have only been able to harness about 20% of the energy of the water flowing over this dam. And the mills in North Williston, once they converted over to the newer technologies, could use up to 90% of the water energy that was flowing. So it would have been cheaper to operate, and by this time with the Downer family, they were moving into other farming operations and probably away from wanting to maintain this mill site itself.
It's so interesting to me that as a culture, we're facing the need to do a rapid energy conversion, from the fossil fuels that we're using to renewable energy. But those things have happened throughout history, that you went from water to diesel, and things can happen almost in a blink of an eye when new technologies are created. Mm-hmm. So hopefully we'll do that jump ourselves. I'd like to look over here for a minute, back at where the original lower farmstead for the Downers were, and let's talk a little bit about one of the things that happened much more recently on this Sucker Brook watershed drainage. Let's go look at that. So we've come down from the top of Five Tree Hill. We connected with you, Sam. We've come forward in time, and we're to what I think is one of the most interesting chapters of the story out here in Sucker Brook Hollow. And I'm going to ask you, Sam, to tell it. But what I know is that we're standing on bedrock. Like, this rock was quarried, and they built the dam for the mill pond for the sawmill. Across us is the parking lot. It is not bedrock. I can see that the slope over there is at the angle of repose. It's unconsolidated material. It's mapped as a cane terrace, which tells me, if that's true, that when there was ice in the valley, there was a river running beside it, depositing sediment, which can be quite deep. Mm-hmm. And this is where the story gets interesting. Prior to 1984, I understand the family who owned the farm, the Downers, could walk across to this mill without crossing the brook. Right. So something wild happened in 1984. Tell us about that.
In the early months of 1984, there were a lot of really high water events, and so what was going on was it was a really high snow year that winter, and then that spring we had a lot of rain, so this was a really, really well saturated area. And then in July, there was this really intense rainstorm where like 4 inches fell, and it was this incredible water event throughout the entire state, caused millions of dollars of damage, and also affected our little Sucker Brook right here in Sucker Hollow. So there were a series of beaver dams that were previously along Sucker Brook, and as the water came rushing down and blasted through each of these dams, it was able to sort of build up speed and build up energy like we were talking about with using mill dams. And so by the time it got to this cane terrace, there was this massive headwaters that just plowed through here and burst open what was the abandoned gravel pit. and was this incredible event that happened very suddenly, literally overnight. They woke up the next morning to find what the Agency of Natural Resources started to call Vermont's Grand Canyon. And it was this incredible event that happened in the blink of an eye. And so having to listen to that in the middle of the night at your farmhouse,
no kidding,
must have been a very scary thing.
And suddenly you can't get from point A to point B,
right?
Because there's a raging, stream, brook, and there's no bridge yet. So like they were cut off from.
Yeah, they were cut off from the rest of their property. Yeah.
But prior to that, like Dan, who lived on this farm, and he has memories.
He does. Dan, who actually owns the property that the Sucker Brook Trail goes through because the town has an easement. He's a private landowner, but when he was a child, he said he could walk from here straight across to that ridge. There was nothing else here. It was just a flat piece of.
When he was little, like 2, they'd hold his hands and just walk over here. Like it was just part of the farm.
Yeah, and he did say his great-grandfather did do some gravel mining here, and sand that probably helped destabilize this area a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. That definitely would have set it up perfectly for this type of event to happen.
So it's just interesting to me to imagine like this glacial river raging here, depositing all that sediment, 13,000, 14,000 years ago. Sucker Brook takes a different course for the next 12,000 years or 13,000 years, and then this giant event happened in the 80s, and it jumped back into this old glacial riverbed and just scoured it out. So it's quite a thing to see. When we think about water power and using it for a sawmill, it can also be, well, we would consider quite destructive, in other circumstances.
Yeah, it took about 20 years to start to repair the damage that happened.
Wow, 20 years. I just love that sound of running water, huh? And we're standing over the original Sucker Brook. This has been a great hike.
It has been.
I brought my timeline that my Vermont Master Naturalist Lorna drew for me, and we've covered all of these chapters today. We talked about the phyllite and the schist bedrock that makes up Five Tree Hill. We went through the glacial story with the glacial erratic and the Came Terrace. We talked a little bit about when early human arrival into this landscape right after the glaciers left and the Champlain Sea was lapping at the shores of Williston, and then early settlement history, the sawmill. Every place has its story, but we've really been able to dive into the Williston story all in this one spot. So thank you all for joining us on another Vermont Master Naturalist hike, and thank you both for being part of the story here today. And I brought you something. I figured we're standing on Sucker Brook, which I know must have been named for fish, but I brought you a suckers, or what you might have called lollipops when you were growing up. Pick your favorite flavor. Oh, the chocolate one's not there. I think I had a chocolate one. Laura, I know you like chocolate.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice of you.
And Bill, what's your favorite flavor?
Purple.
Purple. That's called grape. Excellent. Well, we'll see you next time, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of fun on that hike as well. And again, thank you for joining us on this one.
Hi, this is Laura again. I hope you enjoyed our film. I wanted to show you where the trail was that we were on today, and we started at the top of Five Tree Hill, which is south of the interstate in Williston, Vermont, and we came down to the Sucker Brook Hollow Country Park, which is right along Route 2A. It is actually part of the Crosstown Trail. You can keep going, and you can go down Five Tree Hill, across a field to Mud Pond Country Park and Conservation Area. There are also other trails in Williston, like at Catamount Community Forest, and there are some real gems here, so I hope you get out and see them. I also wanted to point out that where we are in the parking lot at the Sucker Brook Hollow Country Park was the site of an old homestead. And one thing that you can look for are black locust trees. And when you see them, they are a clue that you're at the site of an old homestead, because the black locust trees were planted because they were so rot resistant they could be used for a lot of things, such as fence posts. And I mean, you can see the furrows, they have kind of a wiry top, and you see this played out across the Champlain Valley. You see black locust trees at the site of old farmsteads. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed our film.